welcome. I'm Jeff Sachs of Web Yeshiva, and tonight's program is sponsored by General Foods or Kraft or whoever owns Maxwell House these days, because we're here to talk about the Maxwell House Haggadah, which is, of course, a staple of Jewish homes around the world. And for those of us from America, I'm guessing that each of us at one point have used the Maxwell House Haggadah and certainly have been present at Seder where the Haggadah was used. I'm also, I said hello to him a moment ago before we started the recording. I'll just say hello to my old friend Joel Haber, who's here, who probably has more to say about this topic than I do, because Joel is a scholar of everything that sits at the intersection of Judaism and food, and is actually about to publish a volume on, Joel, what would you describe it? So tell us a word about your upcoming book about Cholent.
Thank you very much. That was completely unnecessary, but in brief, so as not to take too much time, I have a book that's coming out late August, early September, called Cholent, the Most Jewish Food on Earth, and it is the history of all Shabbat stews from around the world, cholent, chamin, dafina, etc.
And it's history, it's halacha, it's sociology, it's recipes, it's
a little bit of everything, mainly history with recipes, but also some of everything else. And it's about basically tracing the roots of our migrations through the diaspora via this multifaceted dish.
Wonderful.
Let me know when it comes out.
I've been waiting for it for many. We've been talking about it for years, and I'm looking forward to finally seeing it.
Thank you. Is there a chat thing on here? If there is, I'll put information.
Yeah.
All right, I see it.
Right. Yeah.
I'm gonna again
maybe
stop.
We'll have you back to Web Yeshiva for a kind of virtual book launch or something in the fall. But in all cases, the Maxwell House Haggadah, I have always used this 1965 deluxe edition, which you see on the screen, and I've quite literally used this very same copy of the Maxwell House Haggadah. It has all of my notes and annotations in it. And my wine stains and a few matzah crumbs from you. I've been using this same Haggadah since elementary school, and maybe if there's time at the end, I'll explain about my own personal relationship to this Haggadah. But the Maxwell House Haggadah, not in this edition. There have been multiple editions throughout. There have been multiple editions over time. The Maxwell House Haggadah goes back to 1932. And it's been published every year, except a couple of years were taken off during World War II when there was paper rationing, when there was paper shortages. But besides that, since 1932, so we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the Maxwell House Haggadah. Since 1932, it's been in continual print in these different editions, and it's estimated that there are over 60 million copies that have been produced, whether or not they're all still extant or not. But that's pretty remarkable. The idea of 60 million copies of this one Haggadah, which, if correct, certainly makes it the most widely distributed Haggadah in history. When you consider there are only about 16 million Jews worldwide. The idea that there are, I don't know, maybe 4 copies of the Haggadah for every Jew alive today is pretty remarkable. This Haggadah is pretty remarkable today. But as we'll do tonight, we'll see that not only does the Maxwell House Haggadah tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, it also, in fact, tells the story of American Jewry, if you know how to read between the lines. It's actually had a bit of a boost in its most recent edition, which you see here on the bottom left, this newer edition, because it was the Haggadah of choice in the White House in 2009, I believe. Barack Obama initiated the first White House Seder, and they very famously used the Maxwell House Haggadah. And then a few years later, in 2019. They put out a custom-made version of the Maxwell House Haggadah, tied in with the then very popular, amazing, marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which was a very popular, very, very Jewishly themed show on Amazon. So they reissued an edition from the 50s when that show is set, but redoing the illustrations and including recipes for brisket, the brisket recipe of the main character, Mrs. Maisel. And today, the company says they print about 1 million copies every year, which are, by and large, you can order them online for a fee, but in most supermarkets and grocery stores across the United States, certainly those that cater to kosher for Passover market of any size, they're distributed for free with your purchase of Maxwell House Kosher for Passover coffee. What's interesting about the Haggadah, and in this way, tonight's presentation differs quite a bit from the others in this Web Yeshiva series, where every night this season, one of our teachers presents a different Haggadah, perhaps their favorite Haggadah, and shares some of the Torah insights from the Haggadah that you could then share at your own Seder. I have nothing to share in that regard because the Maxwell House Haggadah does not really provide any commentary. It's really spare in that regard. It is the text and translation of the Haggadah itself. It was presented as an answer to the growing need for an American audience going back to the 30s, for people that needed to or wanted to conduct a Seder for themselves, but were possibly part of the growing American Jewish community whose connections to Jewish tradition were beginning to wane, whose fluency in the rituals and traditions were beginning to wane. People who, sat at their Zayde's Seder, and Zayde would, grandpa or Tatev, Papa, father would lead the Seder. But now that you're the head of the household, you're a little less fluent in all of the traditions. And the Haggadah was, kind of, as they say, a key ready. In other words, it came with instructions which are so common to us now. All modern Haggadot, almost all modern Haggadot, particularly those with English translation, not only do they give the text of the Haggadah, but they give instructions. Raise the glass here, uncover the matzah there, break the middle matzah, etc. All this kind of the stage directions that are so common today, the kind of stage directions that we are all so familiar with from the world of Art Scroll. When the Art Scroll Seder arrived on the scene in the 1980s, by and large replacing the Birnbaum Seder. People of a certain age will remember the Birnbaum Seder was the Seder of choice for the American Hebrew-English community. The Birnbaum Seder, although it offered a translation, it didn't offer any kind of direction. Suddenly, the Art Scroll came along, and Art Scroll told you, stand here, sit there, take 3 steps backward, take 3 steps forward, have special concentration when you're reciting this verse. Hold the tzitzit in your right hand, kiss them at this point, bow, straighten up. All of the stage directions for what a person is meant to do are there in the Art Scroll. And you see that already in the Maxwell House Haggadah, giving instructions for people that need to or want to have a Seder, but maybe are not so much holding in all of the early rituals. The question, though, of how Maxwell House, how a coffee company, which was not a Jewish-owned company, Maxwell House was never a Jewish-owned company, but the question of how it came to become so associated with this, perhaps the most branded symbolic Jewish product of all, is a fascinating story in the history of American Jewry, and it's told in many different places. And I must confess that when I came to explore this topic, I discovered many Dolim v'Tovim, many smarter and greater people than I had already done much of this research. And I'll commend this particular work, which you see on the screen, Jewish Mad Men, again, playing off of that other popular TV show, Advertising and the Design of the American Jewish Experience by Professor Kerry Steinberg, which was published about a decade ago from Rutgers University Press, which talks about Jews in the advertising industry, but also the attempt to market specifically to Jewish communities. No doubt you can all think, certainly those of us, again, of a certain age, you can all think of advertising campaigns, marketing campaigns that were specifically Jewishly themed. Shapiro's wine. You don't need to be Jewish to enjoy it. I remember those big billboards of an Irish cop holding a glass of Shapiro's wine. You don't need to be Jewish, to love Shapiro's wine. Levy's Jewish rye, and et cetera, et cetera. These were very distinctly Jewish advertising campaigns to a larger market. But then there were also, you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's rye. But what was the advertisement, Joel, for the it was a wine company. You don't need to be, there was also a wine company. No, Levy's, Shapiro's also had that advertisement. It's so thick you can cut it with a knife. But in all cases, so this question of how the Haggadah comes about simply as a marketing tool says a lot about what it is, what was going on in America at the time. Let me go back a second about the Haggadah. The Haggadah, as I said, is very user-friendly. I have always liked it because it's very small and it's paperback. Like you, I'm sure I am fortunate to have family and extended family, and we gather together for the Seder. Rarely is there enough room around the table to sit comfortably. I never understand people that bring these big folio-size Haggadot to the table and then spend the whole evening being nervous that wine is going to get spilled on it. And it's hard enough. There's no room to do Heseba, to lean to your left without knocking into the person next to you, at least around our table, but let alone to spread out a Haggadah that's the size of a Bava Basra. So I find the Passover Haggadah that's small and compact, that you don't have to, some of these Haggadot, they have one line of text and the rest is commentary, and you have to constantly be flipping the pages. I think those Haggadot, and many people, of course, have a custom of buying a new Haggadah every year to go through it and to gain new insights and new things to say and share at the table. And that certainly is a praiseworthy practice. But I think that when you're sitting around the table, you should have, the text of the Haggadah. I have never been a great advocate of all of these. They sell now these kits to make the Haggadah engaging and interesting, etc. I think that the Chachamim and the many years of tradition that have been superimposed on the kernel of what the Haggadah is, I think that's fascinating enough. I don't think we need to have a ping pong ball shooting machine to replicate the plague of hail in order to get people into it. I think the Haggadah itself is interesting enough, and you should come prepared with all of your Vortlach and Divrei Torah and interesting questions and things to say. But that's the work that we have to do beforehand. People that are first doing their research at the table, Bizman shematzu mora munachim lefanecha, I think it's too late for that. We should all be doing that kind of work now. The Maxwell House Haggadah wasn't the first English Haggadah, nor was it the first corporate-sponsored Haggadah. Professor Jonathan Sarna, who's one of the many people that have tread the path of this topic before me, I think points out that there was the first known corporate-sponsored Haggadah was a bank in the West Side Bank in Chicago, which may have indeed been catered to a Jewish market. Maybe they were the mortgage bank for the fledgling Jewish community. In 1919, they were producing a Haggadah, and of course later Streitz's Matzah and Manischewitz brand, they all have their own Haggadot. Somebody just told me earlier when I was coming up from shul that the supermarket chain in America, Publix, which I know my parents shop out in Florida, They have their own Haggadah that they distribute, but none of them have had the impact and lasting power of the of the Manischewitz. One of the interesting things that Professor Sarna points out is that already from the first edition of the Haggadah in 1932, the Haggadah carries the line L'Shana Haba'a B'Yushalayim, that line which we usually sing towards the end of the Haggadah, which I would be surprised if most of us have a Haggadah in the house, unless it's some kind of manuscript reproduction of a very old Haggadah that leaves that line out. But of course, L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, praying that next year we'll celebrate in Jerusalem, is not part of the essential core of the Haggadah. It certainly appeared from a later date, but if for most people, it's like one of the highlights, not just because it comes at the end. When we sing L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, next year we hope to celebrate in Yerushalayim. Of course, some of us are celebrating in Yerushalayim, and it's sung L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim Habnuyah, the rebuilt Jerusalem. But in 1932, there was a kind of trend in America and other diaspora communities to kind of downplay that aspect of Judaism, where we say out loud that we hope next year we won't be in the Lower East Side or in London or in wherever we are, but we'll be back in Jerusalem, because that always carried, from the days of the French Sanhedrin, in the days of Napoleon, this idea of Jews having dual loyalties and not really wanting to be in this diaspora where we're always nudging them to give us more rights. In fact, we prefer to leave. That was something that was said, how do they say, besotovoke, right? In silent, in a whisper. But from the 1932 edition, L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, the following year grant us to be in Jerusalem, was the translation of the Maxwell House Haggadah. And even though there were other English Haggadot, probably none of which are still in wide use, although somebody might have it in their collection, Sarna points out that the Maxwell House already did this. So how did this all come about? It's all thanks to Joseph Jacobs, not to be confused with that other very famous Jew of an older era, Jacob Joseph. Rabbi Jacob Joseph was the chief rabbi of New York, a very, very famous and influential figure. There's still a yeshiva in New York called RJJ, the Rabbi Jacob Joseph Yeshiva. This is not Jacob Joseph, but Joseph Jacob, who lived till 1967. And Joseph Jacobs was an ad man, right? It was an ad man of the old days. First, he was the head of advertising for the Vorwärts newspaper. Of course, the Vorwärts was, in some degree it still exists. The Vorwärts was the major American Jewish Yiddish newspaper, the Daily Vorwärts. At some point, it starts publishing in English and is today known as the Forward. It's still around. The Vorwärts was a Jewish newspaper. It wasn't a religious newspaper. There were, of course, religiously affiliated Yiddish newspapers and even Hebrew newspapers in the United States. But Joseph Jacobs was the head. He was the head of advertising for the Yiddish Vorwärts. In 1919, he leaves the Vorwärts and establishes his own advertising firm called Joseph Jacobs, which still exists. It was run by his family even long after his death in '67. It's still owned and operated. It actually headquartered in Teaneck, not by family members, but by others that took over the firm. And they specialize in advertising to and marketing to the Jewish community. And he had this idea that the major mela, if you were Streitz's matzah or Shapiro's wine, you would advertise to the Jewish community, and you would very likely do it in Yiddish, in the Yiddish press. But Joseph Jacobs had the idea that the major corporations should be paying attention to the Jewish community and its market potential. Remember, in 1840, there were about 250,000 Jews in the United States. By 1914, by the eve of the First World War, there were over 2 million Jews. This is incredible population explosion. And the influx of the, 1.75 million Jews between 1840 and 1914 was largely Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews. The majority of Jews in America before 1840 were largely German Jews, not exclusively, but largely German Jews. Most of us, at least those of us that are Americans, can trace part of our family tree to the great influx of Eastern European Jewry to the United States, in most cases through Ellis Island, largely in the period after 1880, from 1880 till First World War. But unless you have family that were, of course, involved, in the Holocaust, survivors of the Holocaust, victims of the Holocaust, those that came to America before the First World War, you can trace your roots back to this influx of people. And Jacobs has this idea that this is a major marketing opportunity for American corporations, and he attracts clients, and he becomes the Jewish ad man. Obviously, Maxwell House, General Foods, all of these large corporations, they're advertising in all different types of markets. But if they want to reach the Jewish market, they have to do it through this firm of Joseph Jacobs. And one of his early clients is Maxwell House, which is not yet owned by General Foods. A few years later, it's purchased by General Foods. And this is a very, very early advertisement, which appeared in the Yiddish Fovert in March 1922, two different versions of it. They appeared in different weeks. From Maxwell House Cafe, gut bis in Latzen Treffen. Good to the last drop, it says in Yiddish. But this book, which I just showed you, The Jewish Madmen, points out, look at these characters. This is not your Bubba and Zayde, or at least it's not portrayed as people straight out of the shtetl. These were Yiddish speakers, but they were secular Yiddishists, which of course was a very, very significant. Sometimes our memories are a little warped. You think of the Lower East Side in the 1920s. You might in your head be seeing pictures of Fiddler on the Roof, but it wasn't like that. And the author of this book, Professor Steinberg, this Jewish Madmen, points out, look here, this early ad depicts a clean-shaven, a beardless modern man with a stylish hairdo and fashionable shirt and tie ensemble, enjoying his cup of Maxwell House. Right? There's no mistaking the brand name, for it appeared stamped on the coffee tin depicted in the top left corner, and also in bold Hebrew script using the Yiddish translation at the bottom. And the next week, like her male counterpart, the wide smile of this trendy flapper with bobbed hair and sleeveless dress registers her satisfaction with Maxwell House Coffee of the Cheek Neal Coffee Company. That was the original company that owned the brand. Both male and female figures established direct contact with the viewer in an effort to personalize the product. I'm not certain, but it's very possible that these images, these illustrations of the gentleman enjoying his coffee and the lady enjoying her coffee, these may have appeared in general marketing to the wider non-Jewish audience, and here all they've done is translated the text into Yiddish and placed it in the forwards. However, Maxwell House, pitching to the Jewish community and seeing results, notice that 1 week of the year, sales plummet. Jews were not buying coffee during Pesach. It's interesting that already, 100 years ago, they had such fine-tuned market study that they knew that for 1 week a year in the large Jewish markets, Jews aren't buying coffee, and this has to do with a kind of I'll say urban legend or chumrah, which was not really based on too much solid, a halachic stringency, which was not really based on too much solid evidence. You know that people take Pesach very seriously. And there's all types of stringencies about cleaning and koshering and what people eat and what people don't eat. And beyond the letter of the law, there are all types of customs of things that people are careful not to eat. People are careful not, if a potato falls on the floor, there are people who won't eat it. Because you never know what's on the floor. Like there could be like a little chametz left over. Floors can never get completely clean. And if your potato fell on the floor, so some people will be machmir and not eat it. I'm not advocating this position. And it's probably not defensible based upon any kind of reasonable halachic position. But when it comes to Pesach, people really do, frankly, go a little overboard. There was an idea that coffee is kitniot. Kitniot, of course, being, this large category of legumes, which Ashkenazim and, in America in the 1920s, we're talking almost exclusively, these 2 million Jews, we're talking almost exclusively Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim don't eat kitniot, rice and corn and beans, and, in addition, obviously, to chametz gamur. And there was a mistaken belief that kitniot, that coffee, which, after all, what are coffee? Coffee are beans, coffee beans. But coffee beans are kitniot, except, of course, coffee beans are not really beans. It's a misnomer to call. We call them beans because they look like beans, but in fact, coffee is a berry. It's a fruit. And what we do is we take the kernel and we roast it and grind it and make it into coffee. Already in the 18th century, the Chida of Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who was, one of the most significant rabbinic figures of the 17th century. He dies in 1806 in Italy, having been born in Jerusalem, but having traveled really the world over. It was a very fascinating character, the Chida. He writes something like 80 books, 80 Sfarim. So in his Tov Ayin, he writes the following. He mentions Rabbi Avraham Broda. Rabbi Avraham Broda was a German Rav. He was a rabbi in the cities of Metz and Frankfurt. He had died in 1717. So, well over 100 years, almost 100 years before the Chida. So he points out that this Rav Avraham Broda, Machmir Gambe, you see this word here? Gambe, kafe. Shehechshivo kitniot ledavar ze yislach adon ki hu pri eitz ve'ilan asher behindia. This is the Chida says the kafe, coffee. I'm from New Jersey, so I'll say coffee. Coffee is in fact the fruit of a tree. And it grows, he says its origin is in India and Morocco. And he says, and in my wanderings, I even saw a coffee bush growing in Amsterdam. I was unaware that Amsterdam is a big market for the production of coffee, but in the 17th century, the Chida had seen coffee growing in Amsterdam. B'chatzer ginat bitan, v'chein haya b'Pisa, and I saw it also in Pisa in Italy. Ve'ein lahachmir b'kafe, and we need not be stringent like this opinion of Rav Broda that coffee is kitniot. V'nira vadai delone elam me'enei hagaon ki hu priya eitz. And it can't be that this Rav Broda 100 years ago, says the Chida in the 17th century, can't be that Rav Broda really thought that botanologically it was kitniot. Rak mishum she'eno benimtza v'dalat ha'am lo yadu v'lo yavinu shehu pri eitz v'yavou lahakel b'kitniot. It wasn't even that he thought that mistakenly that it was kitniot. He thought that it was similar enough to kitniot that if we allow coffee beans, which are not beans, people will come to be confused and they'll actually eat regular kitniot mamash. Lefrutz geder shegedra rishonim v'chein hayam machmir af b'kafe. And so he was stringent about coffee. In other words, in some ways, kitniot, there are two possibilities. What's the problem with kitniot? Either kitniot can be made into flour-like substances. Like we see, after all, corn flour is used for all types of things, and rice flour can be used for all types of things. Or kitniot, beans and grains and beans and legumes, and were shipped together, in kind of mixed up ways in barrels that spilled one into the other. Anybody that goes to the shuk here in Jerusalem, and you can just get a satchel full of dried peas or corn or grain or barley or whatever it is. That things get mixed up, and you have to check through it to make sure that there isn't something there that you don't want. It can happen that a grainberry can pop into a bag of beans. So here he says it's a gzeira on a gzeira. It's a chumra on a chumra, stringency on top of a stringency with a cherry on top or a coffee bean on top. And the Chida says we need not be stringent for this opinion. Im charchu kafe kodem Pesach yesh lahakel afilu b'Ashkenaz. V'chen katav harav Shvut Yaakov v'lo kerav chok Yisrael v'chulei v'chulei. There's another paragraph where the Chida mentions that there was also stringent about tea. He must have been a real machmir about tea. Why? Because tea, what's tea? Everybody knows that tea is certainly not chametz, and tea leaves are certainly not. Everybody knows tea is an herb, right? There's even this, pardon my expression, crazy stringency to think that maybe coffee is close enough to kitniot, and if we allow coffee, people will come to be lenient about actual kitniot, which he dismisses as an unwarranted stringency. But everybody knows that tea doesn't even look like a bean. A coffee bean does look like a bean, but tea doesn't look like a bean. So he says there was a stringency about tea. Why? Because everybody knows what's the most Jewish way of drinking a cup of tea? To reuse the tea bag. This really is like straight out of like central casting, Yiddish mama, right? I'll have a glass of hot water and I'll reuse the tea bag. There's people, what would they do? They would take the tea. It was probably loose tea. They would strain it, they would dry it, and they would reuse it. So maybe they would come to reuse the tea leaves that had been used before Pesach with chametz stick dishes. And okay, so he says this is also a kind of crazy stringency. And then this is all codified in the Sharei Tshuva. This is the commentary of the Sharei Tshuva of Rav Chaim Mordechai Margoliot, who lives in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. A very important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. He was the Rav in Dubno, in the town of Dubno, in Galicia. And he also codifies that, of course, it's simply obviously permitted to use coffee in these parts of the world. So even though it's already from the 18th and early 19th century, well established that there is nothing to worry about when it comes to coffee, nevertheless, there was still this kind of urban legend of sort that people didn't drink coffee on Pesach. And Maxwell House sees that this is really fascinating, because this is the same community that we're talking about of people that are already beginning to be distanced from tradition, so much so that they need an English-speaking Haggadah. But nevertheless, that's the funny thing about tradition. People maintain funny connections to the strangest of things. There are people that are, and any mitzvah that a Jew does is wonderful and welcome and as encouraged. But there are people that are really not stringent about all types of things. There are people that don't keep kosher all year long, let alone kosher for Passover. But they don't eat bread. They know that a Jew doesn't eat bread. They're eating all types of other things that are technically chametz. They might eat crackers, right? They might eat crackers on Pesach, and crackers are as just chametz as bread is. But they know they don't eat bread. You don't take a slice of bread and eat it on Pesach. I had members of my own extended family who fell into such a category. When it comes to Pesach, people maintain these deep-rooted connections. So that generation, they mistakenly were being stringent about this one thing about not drinking coffee on Pesach. So Maxwell House had a problem because Joseph Jacobs convinces them, look, you have to market to the Jewish community. And they see great results. They see great results in their campaign, except for this 1 week a year. So Joseph Jacobs has a solution. He finds a rabbi, not just any rabbi for hire, but really one of the most significant rabbinic and halachic figures in New York at that time, Rav Betzalel Rosen, or in English he was known as Zalil Rosen. Sometimes you see his name is signed Z Rosen, which can be a little confusing because his name was Betzalel, but I guess his nickname was Zalil. So this is Rav Betzalel Rosen. He was a Rav on the Lower East Side. Here's his tombstone, which is in that Jewish cemetery out in Queens, where my own ancestors are buried. He was a rather significant Rav. He's one of the leaders of the Agudas Yisrael, the right-wing rabbinic organization in the United States. He dies in 1929, and he issues a psak that says, indeed, coffee is not kitniot, it's not chametz. You can drink it on Pesach, and it's good. It's good to the last. It's good to the last drop. And here you see an advertisement already from 1923, right? That it's Maxwell House coffee. This is before the Haggadah. This is 9 years before the Haggadah arrives. But they're already advertising in the Jewish press, mitzvah aleinu l'saper. And it's borrowing the language of the Haggadah. There's an obligation upon us, l'saper, meaning l'saper sipur yetziat Mitzrayim, but we're not telling the story of the Exodus, we're telling the story of Maxwell House coffee, which is kosher, is kosher. Maxwell House coffee is kosher lePesach, with the stamp and the hechsher of this Rav Betzalel Rosen, that there's nothing to fear. Coffee can be drunk according to all halachic opinions on Pesach. In 1929, Maxwell House sales plummet once again, not just in the Jewish community, but across the country. For some reason, after the market crash of 1929, during the Depression, coffee sales, particularly, a kind of more high-end, you pay for all that packaging, you pay for the convenience, and you pay for having instant coffee. Maxwell House was a brand that just suffered during the penny pinching that people had to do during the Depression. And the company, now owned by General Foods, which was a major, as it is still today, a major conglomerate, invests a staggering amount of money in advertising in order to bolster their brand. They something like $3.5 million, which in the 1920s was a fortune of money, to revive their brand. They become corporate sponsors of what was then a very popular radio program, the Maxwell House. I forget what it was called, the Maxwell House show on the radio. All of these. When radio was the main form of, was the almost exclusive form of electronic media, corporate sponsorship of these shows was just de rigueur. That's why they're called soap operas, because those radio dramas, which then later migrate to television, were all sponsored by the soap companies, pitching to the housewives that had to keep their clothing sparkling white. So in 1932, you see here on the screen, you see the 1933 second edition, and I thank my friend and neighbor Alan Abramowitz, who is online with us, who has a museum of the Maxwell House Haggadahs. He's got a large collection, and he shared with me some pictures from that collection. So Joseph's has this idea of not only reminding people that coffee is kosher Pesach, but of promoting the brand through the distribution of the Haggadah Shel Pesach, the first edition of the Maxwell House Haggadah, 1932, which always carries an advertisement on the back cover, on the inside back cover, for the coffees, which of course are certified kosher Pesach. Here you see, serve your family and friends these famous coffees of Maxwell House, the original Passover coffee. What was it? The original Passover coffee. All coffee is the original Passover coffee, but they're the ones that reminded everyone. They're the ones that got the rabbi to say, drink coffee on Pesach. And then you see the instant coffee. Right? Instant coffee, the process of freeze drying coffee so that it can then be rehydrated as what we call instant coffee. The technology for that was already around from the 1890s, but it wasn't widespread. It was only shortly before this that you could go into the supermarket and get a can of instant coffee, which becomes known, as you see here. What's the advertisement say? The original Passover instant coffee, you see here on the right. This famous Shabbos coffee is the cantor's choice for everyday enjoyment. The cantor, the chazan, well, Saturday morning has to get up and go and lead the services in the congregation. He needs a nice hot cup of coffee from Maxwell House to get going, to get the larynx loosened up and caffeinated, so that he can lead the services. It's the cantor's choice for coffee, but instant coffee, and Maxwell House being the leading brand for the Jewish consumer, instant coffee solves the problem. How do you get a nice, good, hot cup of fresh brewed coffee on Shabbat? Today, we've all become much more finicky about our coffee. I myself am a real feinschmecker when it comes to coffee, and I will not touch instant coffee. But in terms of Shabbat, we all, people today have machines in their home that grind the beans as it's going into the machine, so to get the fresh cup of coffee. But obviously, there are all types of problems, not just electricity, but the problems of bishul, of cooking on Shabbat, which cannot easily be circumvented. And there are all types of ways, and our own Rabbi Fink has given shiurim on this, and there are all types of other solutions which I won't go into now. But instant coffee was the easiest way around the problem of making coffee on Shabbat. And then, of course, there's Sanka, which I don't think is around anymore, but that was the first variety of instant decaffeinated coffee, which apparently tasted something like axle grease, but was the only solution for people who needed instant coffee. The earliest editions of the Haggadah, in the back cover, had these 5-year calendars to tell you the dates of the holidays. It served almost like an almanac. If you remember the old Birnbaum Machzorim for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which was really then before Art School, was really the only Hebrew English machzor for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that was in wide use. It also had in the back this kind of list of what are the dates of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in all the upcoming years. And I remember as a kid, I think it went up to like 1980 or something like that. And I remember as a kid, like wondering, like, what's going to happen when the machzor goes out of date. Nobody would do this anymore because, of course, we all have access to the internet and to calendars, and we carry around the collected wisdom of civilization in our phones, on our pocket. And if I want to know what date Purim is going to be in 100 years from now, I can look it up. But this very little device in the back of the Haggadah showed that it was pitching to an audience that needed this kind of Jewish support, like Jewish support system. How would you know when the upcoming holiday was going to be? People didn't have the fluency to know always what was the Jewish date and where were we holding in the calendar. So the very presence of this feature in those Haggadot in the early years says something about the audience to which it was catering. Of course, the whole point of the Haggadah was, and you see in this advertisement from 1932 from Maxwell House Cafe, it's frei, meaning it's free. It was always distributed for free with your purchase of the Maxwell House products, kosher for Passover. And in most groceries, we've seen there's like a little cardboard stand that has piles of the Haggadot. And I think it was mostly on the honor system that people could take their Haggadah with their purchase. I know in my home we had a big stack of them, the 1965 deluxe edition, which was, this was the edition that was used, for a decade or so before they would get a facelift from time to time. Here you see good bis latzen Tropfen, good to the last drop, with the hashgacha that it is kosher for Passover. This is the edition. This is not just the edition. This is my actual own Haggadah that I use. It's undergone changes. The Haggadah, from time to time, has undergone changes. Perhaps the most significant, the early editions used a rather motley arrangement of just repurposed woodcuts from earlier Haggadot. They weren't all necessarily of the same variety or from the same artists. You see here on the upper right the four sons depicted in the 1932. But by 1965, it's all been modernized with these kinds of sleek, Saul Raskin-esque line drawings of the happy American Jewish family sitting around the Seder. But you also see the introduction in the 60s of transliteration. The major texts of the Haggadah appear in transliteration so that any American Jew sitting around the Seder table can read along. Right? Transliterated into typical Ashkenazis. Right? And then the instructions. Oh, wait, I skipped a page. There you go. This is the central page of the Haggadah. My wine stains look something like a Rorschach test, and you can see even my own little notes that I've made to myself over the years about how much matzah and what to do and etc. But it tells you take the 2 whole matzahs, and it tells you the brachot there. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilos matzah, right? Al achilos moror, M-A-W-R-O-R, moror. And the transliteration again is showing that the Haggadah is adapting to the Jewish community of the time. This is the 1960s. In the most recent versions, the translation has undergone an upgrade. I should point out the work of my friend Yosef Lindell of Silver Spring, Maryland, who's really something of a scholar of translation of Jewish texts, of the Seder, the Machzor, the Tanakh, the Haggadah. He seems to have been the one to discover that the uncredited translator, the original translator, was somebody named David Hausdorff. His name doesn't appear in any of the Haggadot. He was an employee of the Joseph Jacobs advertising company, and he's the one that provided the original translation, which to our ears today seems a little clunky. It has a lot of these and a lot of thous, and of course, as was standard, it uses very gendered language. And the newest editions of the Maxwell House Haggadah have done quite a bit to change that. These 1960s line drawings that really do look like could be the family from The Amazing Mrs. Maisel, has been replaced largely with kind of generic photographs of ritual objects, a kind of like modernized nostalgia for a Judaism that people may be a little bit only marginally connected to. I guess that's part of nostalgia, to have an idea about something which you're no longer deeply rooted in. And of course, it's also reduced all those archaisms, the these and the thous, and it's done a lot to neutralize gendered language. God, instead of being referred to as a king, is referred to as a monarch. Instead of being referred to as our father, he's referred to as our parent. But the 1965 my Maxwell House Haggadah is still my Haggadah of choice, and all of these Haggadot and this whole story of this strange phenomena that a non-Jewish coffee company becomes the most identified object with American Jewish ritual. Is it quintessentially American story? It's First of all, it's quintessentially American because it's so rooted in consumerism and marketing, right? In other words, those of you that may have seen that television show Mad Men, about which that book that tells the history of this, of course, is playing off of, understands the degree to which Madison Avenue and marketing was so tied up with trends in Jewish life, and so many significant figures in the Jewish world were involved in that, as they were involved in all forms of media in the United States. And particularly, this is a New York story, right? The Madison Avenue, the center of marketing, is in the heart of New York. These corporations are based very much in New York, and of course, the Jewish community that was being marketed to was overwhelmingly New York centric. This is before even the move out to the suburbs of much of New Jersey, where I grew up. At this time, my parents' families were either in Brooklyn or in Newark. Right before Newark starts to fall apart in the 1960s, it's part of and then starts populating all of the Jewish communities in New Jersey, in Essex County, in Bergen County, and elsewhere. This is Newark. These are the Jews of the novels of Philip Roth. They're the ones sitting around the table holding the Maxwell House Haggadah. But it also tells the story of American Jewry because it adapts to the needs of a community who, no matter the degree of assimilation, by and large, a vast majority, nevertheless, maintain some connection to this one night, to this one ritual of sitting around the table. And even if it's a family sitting around the table, not eating kosher for Passover food, and not even necessarily going through all the proper rituals, certainly not measuring out the precise amounts of matzah and moror and all other types of craziness that goes on around our Seder tables. And maybe they even have a loaf of bread on the table, which happens at Passover Seders. Nevertheless, next to that loaf of bread is like you're likely to find the Maxwell House Haggadah. And in that regard, it's a reflection of fascinating trends in American Jewry, who maintain some connection to these rituals, even if they're observed only in the breach. It's an acknowledgement of the centrality of Pesach and of the Passover Seder, particularly because it's something that's celebrated not in the synagogue, but in the home, around the table with family. That the Haggadah, that old line, about secularism in Israel, that the synagogue that people don't pray in is an Orthodox one. The Haggadah that people may not read cover to cover is the Maxwell House Haggadah. For myself, growing up in a family not too much unlike the one I've described, my earliest Jewish memories are the Passover Seder, which was always held in my parents' home. My parents' home was larger than their parents' home. It was the meeting ground for for the extended family. And even as a little boy, I remember Passover Seder. I remember going with my mother. I couldn't have been in more than first or second grade, because this memory takes place in the home that we lived in before we moved to the home that I spent the rest of my time in. I remember on an Erev Pesach going with my mother to the supermarket. That's part of Pesach also, the last minute run to the supermarket, the last minute run to the A&P to get the things that you forgot. And I remember her telling me in the car that, oh yeah, well, of course, tonight we're having the Seder. And I remember her explaining to me what the Seder was. And I even remember her telling me that, next year or the year after, you're going to have to say the 4 questions, which of course terrified me, the idea that I would have to do that. And ultimately, when I did it by reading the transliteration from this very Haggadah. Right, it's right here. Manishtano halaylo hazeh mikol haleilos. Right, and so this Haggadah was part and parcel of my own initiation to the magic of Jewish life and ritual. And of course, I've gone on to other things in Jewish life and learning, thank God. But this was the groundwork. I remember being in the car, a little boy, and my mother telling me, tonight is Passover, and we're going to have a Seder, and Grandma and Grandpa are going to come, and this aunt and that uncle are going to come, and we're going to have dinner, and we read the story of how God took us out of Egypt in this book. And I'm thinking, what, we were in Egypt? Wait, what's going on here? It was the, and that's why I've always maintained a special connection to the Maxwell House Haggadah, which is, of course, still, after all these many years, the original Passover coffees for your holiday enjoyment. Some of these brands are no longer around. Yuban, Brim, Sanka, of course. But after all these years, nevertheless, it's still good to the last drop. And we hope that your Seder will be good to the last drop. Usually when we talk about the last drop at the Seder, we're talking about the last drop of wine. But the next morning, you might want a good, strong cup of Maxwell House to get you up to go to shul on the first morning of Yom Tov. And that's part of the story of the Exodus, and it's part of the story of the American Jewish experience with the Maxwell House Haggadah. So we wish you all Zisin Ksherin Pesach, in the words of one of those Yiddish advertisements, and Chag Kosher V'Sameach. And we look forward to continuing to learn with you here on WebYeshiva.